Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Tom Pearson. I'm CEO of the SETI Institute, and I'm standing in for Adrian Brown and the others who normally MC our weekly seminar series, and I'm very happy and proud to do that. And I'll be introducing Dr. Mark Showalter in a moment. I also want to let everybody know today is happens to be a very special occasion, and you see the beginnings of what will unfold after our seminar over here on the table. But we are, in addition to having the pleasure of hearing from Mark today, we're also going to, at the end, celebrate the 100th birthday of a very special person to the SETI Institute here, and it's Inger Fries, who is sitting up here in the front row. Inger has been a friend and donor to the SETI Institute for many, many years, and is a very good friend to many of our science team. And technically tomorrow is her birthday, as she always reminds me every year. Her birthday is on tax day. And so it's a very special day. And she actually has a number of guests here with her today from other parts of her life. She lives here in the Bay Area, but she also has a home in Nova Scotia, and she is from Denmark, and there are a number of guests here. So Inger, we will celebrate your birthday after the colloquium. So now let me move on to introduce Dr. Mark Showalter. And Mark's talk today is a very special one. As I'm sure all of you know, Mark is a very distinguished scientist and specializes in understanding the rings around the planets in our solar system, and is the leader of the NASA Solar System Rings database. He has a very major grant here at the SETI Institute. His work has been featured on the cover of Science magazine and many other places. However, today he's not going to be speaking to us precisely about that, although he may weave it in some way or another. But he's actually going to speak to us about some of his personal experiences experiencing life in very different environments here on our planet Earth. And he will share with us some of his observations of how that relates to astrobiology, and how it relates to the potential for life that might be found elsewhere in the universe. And so it's my pleasure to introduce Mark. Before I do hand the mic over to him, let me remind everyone that we do encourage questions. However, we are also recording the seminar for access on our website to the world in general. And the only way that your questions are going to get onto the tape so that the eventual viewers of this seminar on the website will be if you raise your hand and let me bring you this microphone so that your question can be recorded and Mark can answer those. And it would be best if we hold the questions till the end of his talk. So without further ado, let me introduce Dr. Mark Showalter.
Thanks, Tom. It's great to be here today, and I'm particularly honored, Inger, to be able to speak on this special occasion for you. As Tom noted, I'm going to be doing something a little bit different today. The tradition here at the SETI Institute is for science talks, seminars on Wednesday afternoon, and I'm going to do my best to kind of live up to that, but I'm certainly speaking on a topic that's well outside my field of expertise, and that's why the title says Marine Biodiversity and Pretty Pictures, because at least of those two, I think I know a little bit about one of them. But when Adrian spoke to me about giving a talk soon, I was noting that we were heading off to Raja Ampat, a very distant region of Indonesia, for a scuba diving trip, and that seemed like maybe that would be a topic of interest to the SETI Institute. So here we go. I think I need to begin with a little bit of a disclaimer, because I'll do my best to make this a science talk, but first of all, I am not a marine biologist. I am not a biologist. I never even took biology. And like any good scientist, I have a tendency to just kind of make things up as I go. So I know there are a few other friends who are divers here in the audience, and you might hear people yelling out corrections to some things I say. But I'll do my best to acknowledge what I don't know, which is quite substantial. There might be a few reasons why I do have some qualifications, however. If we're talking about marine biodiversity, I have seen a lot of marine animals. I have about 600 log dives. I also, just being a scientist that I am and an image analyst, I have a desperate, perhaps pathological, personal need to make sense out of the things I'm looking at. And I also know how to Google things. So, you know, I find things out when I don't know what the answer is. Or at least I can quote Wikipedia. Okay, I might have some qualifications, some in slightly firmer ground on the topic of pretty pictures. Because, first of all, I have taken a lot of pictures, 4,500 on this trip, in fact. I will also say that my mother thinks some of them are kind of pretty. At least that's what she tells me. So, hopefully she's a reasonable judge of all that. Let me give you some context for where we are talking about now in the world. Thank you to Google Maps for this. Here's my pointer. San Francisco and our area is off the edge of the earth over here. You can see Japan, you can see Singapore. I'm basically tracing the route that we had to fly to then end up in this region and this region of Indonesia. Here's Australia down beneath. We spent a few days on the island of Sulawesi. I'll talk about that in a moment. And then we went out to a little town called Sorong, which is on the western end of the island that is half Papua New Guinea. The island is New Guinea. The eastern half is Papua New Guinea. The western half belongs to Indonesia. So we landed there from here, from over there. And spent about then 2 weeks on a dive boat exploring this region of the world, which is a very, very remote place. It takes 3 days just to get there with all the stops you have to make. Zooming in a little bit, so this is the island of Sulawesi. This is the landing, the town of Manado, which is where we started. And I'll zoom into our destination for the first few days, and then over to Sorong and the Raja Ampat region in here. Close-up now of the first stop. This is on the opposite side of the landing strip, which was kind of out here. This is Lembe Strait, which is world-renowned as a location for what is called muck diving. Now, that's a very technical term, and probably one in desperate need of a good marketing campaign. But what it basically means is diving where there is no reef. It means diving over sand, diving over mud, maybe diving over muck, honestly, but there simply is no coral beneath you. Now that sounds like something that would make it less desirable, but in fact some of the weirdest critters in the world live in these environments, and Lembe Strait in particular is renowned for its muck diving and for some creatures that are seen there and essentially nowhere else in the world. So we spent 3 days there before moving on to Sorong and getting on a boat called the Pendito, owned by a Swiss man, and has been operating in the Raja Ampat waters for about 20 years now. There are now more than 20 dive boats, I believe, operating in this region. It's a very large region, though, so it's not overdived by any definition. The nice thing about living on a dive boat for a week is you get to basically have everything taken care of, no schlepping of big heavy equipment around because it's all ready for you, and you can dive 3, 4, sometimes even 5 times a day. So that was our residence then for about 2 weeks. There's a particular reason why my spouse and I tend to go to the Pacific rather than the Atlantic for our dive trips. And it actually goes back to some interesting geology that I just thought I'd remind you of. Many of you, I think, have heard of Pangaea and are familiar with continental drift. If you go back 225 million years ago, there was basically one continent on Earth. And then through continental drift over a period of hundreds of millions of years, we end up with the continents we now see today. If you notice, however, there was no Atlantic Ocean 225 million years ago. South America and Africa essentially abutted one another and only slowly separated and moved apart and created what is now the Atlantic Ocean. The Pacific Ocean has been around for a much longer time. And the reason you find much more biodiversity in the Pacific is just because it's had more time for life to evolve there. Most of the life in the Atlantic has been evolved from species that managed to get there from the Pacific, in fact. So I should also just introduce my camera. My camera has evolved over the years, or at least I've had several of them. I used to tell people that I would never carry a camera underwater that was bigger than my head. And I guess my head's bigger than it used to be, I don't know. But basically we have inside a familiar Olympus camera, a digital SLR, nothing particularly special. We have a bunch of O-rings, I have a zoom lens on it, and here's a gear that I can use to actually adjust the zoom on my lens. Then I have two very large strobes. These strobes are actually attached by an optical wire to the flash of the camera. The camera will flash, but that's blocked off. You don't want the light coming from the camera itself. And these two strobes then are the things that actually illuminate the scene. So I can actually even demonstrate that if you'll all sort of smile. Can you sort of, no, well, let's see what I can do. Okay. Is it going to work? I'm shooting into the light. Ah, it sort of worked. Let's try one more. Smile, everybody. Inger, you weren't smiling. There we go. Great. So now you can know what it's like to be a fish on one of my dives. All right, so I promised you pretty pictures, or at least pictures, so here goes. I did a bit of wide-angle photography, mostly focused on close-ups. That's honestly easier. It's also the way you get some of the really most interesting shots. Wide-angle is much harder because you have to depend on sunlight a whole lot more than you do if it's an up-close little target. You can illuminate it yourself. Yes, yes. The fact that these fish are white is because I have illuminated them. The dark blue is because my flash only goes so far, and the more distant things are actually just sunlight coming through the water. Of course, red light does not make it through more than even 10 feet of water. So any picture taken at depth, if you did not have a strobe, you would see no red whatsoever. It would be entirely blue and green. And that's one of the reasons we need really powerful strobes to do our photography. But that was just a random school of fish called striped, oh, I forget. I should also note that I had ambitious plans to look up every fish species on my talk and every other animal species, and, well, as I said earlier, I have a tendency to make things up as I go. I didn't quite get there. But let me move on. Typical small juvenile fish. Fish that are juveniles tend to look very, very different from their adult counterparts. Once again, and in fact, often you can't even find these in the guidebooks because the guidebooks tend to show you the adult version of a fish, and the child and the juvenile may look very, very different. This was just a couple of inches long. Here's another wide-angle shot. I just wanted to show you some of the geology of the islands we were visiting. They tended to be pushed up and have basically coral atolls for the most part. And then the motion of the water over millennia and thousands, millions of years often clears out gaps and eats away underneath them. So I'm literally under the island at this point. The island is like a mushroom that spreads out above you. And with a little bit of strobing of the light, I got some color in here. The more distant things obviously don't have any color at all. These are soft corals. These are very common, and they're very colorful if you can illuminate them. They are also, as I said, soft corals. Don't think of the rocky white things. If you push these, they'll just sort of fold over, and that's not recommended to touch anything, of course. This is a sea fan. We see many of them. They're very popular as habitats for a lot of other species, as I will be showing you shortly. Okay, fish often travel in mated pairs, and this is one that I tracked for a little while in one of my dives. They didn't easily pose quite so nicely until I took my time with it. But you often see, particularly these are a type of I think, butterfly fish, and they often travel in pairs. Angelfish also often travel in pairs. Blue might be a triggerfish. As I said, I have a guidebook in case we want to look things up. As I said, I didn't look everything up. By the way, another just note, I have good friends who are birders. Birders will be able to rattle off every species they've ever seen in their lives. They will know where it was. They will know when it was. Divers don't do that. In fact, it's essentially an impossibility because there are so many more species underwater than there are of birds on land and in the air. Perhaps there's certainly less than 1,000 species of birds in North America. We easily saw 1,000 species of fish on this trip. So you very quickly lose track of what you've seen, what you haven't seen, where you've seen it, unless there was something particularly spectacular about it. This is a nudibranch, very, very common, a prize target for photographers, of course, for fairly obvious reasons. Think about the roots of the word nudi, naked, branch, as in bronchitis or something similar, means lungs. And so this is a naked lunged creature, and these are in fact the lungs which are exposed to the water, and they absorb the oxygen that the creature needs from the water directly. These are also basically just sea slugs. These are the antennas that you would see on any snail climbing up your daylilies out in your front yard, but it's basically a sea slug with its lungs on the outside. They tend to be very colorful. I can only imagine that that probably means they don't taste very good, because surely something that is small and not moving very fast would not otherwise want to advertise its presence. But nudibranchs just amaze one in their diversity. There are many different types. I have an entire book of nudibranchs, perhaps thousands of species all by itself. Here's one just crawling across some basically muck from the Lembe Strait. Another close-up. They're just breathtakingly beautiful. And I could rattle off species names if I looked them up, but it probably wouldn't matter to anybody anyway. So I just focus on a few of them for just a few minutes, and then move elsewhere into the animal family tree. I should note that there are essentially no grass or other plants when you get down to depth, for a very basic reason. Well, let's think about it. What color are plants? Green. Okay. What color of light do they reflect, therefore? Green. What color do they absorb? Red. Okay. And so if seawater or all water absorbs red light, then plants cannot survive at any depth, because essentially the light that they need is the light that is absorbed by the water. Good. This is a worm. It lives in a little shell that is underneath, and they can retract, and I'll show you some examples of that later. But just one of the typical beautiful patterns that one sees underwater. Inch or two across. This is a type of octopus. Anybody want to guess what type of octopus? Red octopus, yes. Although essentially every octopus has the capability of changing color, this one was sort of living up to its name by staying red. I would also note you can see a lot of texture. These white bumps, they can come and go. It can change its not just its appearance, but the shape of its surface, or the shape of its skin, on a whim. And it's quite dramatic to see it going across the surface, and as the color of the surface changes, it changes along with it. It can be quite amazing, and it can be spiky, and then it can be smooth, and so on. Haven't seen too many of these red octopus. They live in the Lembe Strait, and I haven't seen them elsewhere. Octopus tend to be very reclusive. They tend to come out mostly at night. This was in fact taken on a night dive. And if you find one, it's usually trying to get away from you and trying to go into the nearest hole. But eventually, I guess I blinded it with my light or something like that. Yes, the fish go running when they see me coming, I think. This is a star puffer, just the close-up of the face. They're actually rather large fish of the order this big. I've seen so many star puffers over the years, and I said, that must be a pregnant female. But in fact, that's how they look. They just have very, very big bellies. Very sharp teeth, but they're not aggressive in any way. They also, if you look close, you can see little smell glands that are actually right there on the nose. Very similar to our olfactory senses. They can pick up scents. This is a type of I gotta watch my little cord here. Type of scorpion fish. Scorpion fish are one of the prizes of the Lembe Strait. They tend to be very common and very diverse. This is a big beak that sort of hangs out over its head, reminiscent of frogfish, which also have a kind of a lure. I suspect it would sit on the ground, wave this, and expect something to get its attention, and then slurp, and dinner is had. So, I really meant to look up this fish because it was just bizarre in its appearance. Once again, what you see these kind of olfactory glands on its face as well. Free swimming, not some fish, of course, sit on the bottom, others swim freely. And this one was actually near the surface, which is why the lighting has got a little bit of sunlight added to it. These are tunicates. I didn't make up the colors. They are actually those colors, as pretty much as well as I could see them and reproduce them. Tunicates, you think it's kind of boring. Look sort of like sponges, perhaps. They just sit there. They don't move. They spend their entire lives in one place. We should respect them a little bit because of a little line that you can see right there, and maybe you can see one right there. They are actually primitive, essentially spinal cords. This is chordata. This is the same family tree out of which all of us came. So although these are very primitive species that arrived rather early in the history of the evolutionary history of the ocean realm, they are in fact the precursors of essentially all the life that is around on land and all the fish and so on. So scale, these are maybe that big. And they're quite common underwater. What I liked about this was that I was able to pick out a few, and they all have different tints, and this one had, the tints were all kind of different and they were all close together. Here is a nudibranch on a tunicate, so it sort of seemed like a nice combination to put together. One of the things that you notice underwater, and it's very interesting I think, is that whenever you see something, it's interesting to stop and think, what is that on? Now, if it's not free swimming, the thing that is on is probably either also alive or it was alive. So, and then what was that on? And you can almost get this infinite regression of living thing on top of living thing on top of living thing. I think it's a nice metaphor for a lot of what, of how our biosphere actually works, is that living things build their lives on top of other living things. This is something that is nicknamed the electric clam, and I wish I could show you what it really looked like, but in a minute I'll show you as best I can. Gorgeous creature, bright red and with the tentacles coming out. What I want to call your attention to is this bright line, which is basically one lip, and maybe there's a little bit of bright along the other lip here, and it's open in between. That's water and hopefully nutrition going in and out. However, I will take another picture taken just moments later, and I tried to overlay them as best I could. So now let's kind of go back and forth. And you'll notice that the lighting is different. When you see this in nature, you are seeing the reason it's called the electric clam, it looks like bolts of electricity shooting back and forth across each lip. Now that, in reality, it is nothing like that, is in fact waving of very fine hair, cilia, that somehow are oriented in such a way that they either do or do not reflect the light. But it's just quite stunning to see, and I couldn't quite capture that in still photography, but you can kind of see what we're seeing underwater. And it took less than a second for one of these bolts of lightning, as it appeared, to go across the lip. The evolutionary advantage of that, I have no idea. I tried to speculate as to why that would be. It's not actually glowing, so it's not attracting anything, and a clam doesn't attract its food anyway. It just filters. So I'm sorry, I'm stumped on that one. If somebody has a hypothesis, I'd love to hear it. Okay, one of my personal favorite species is the Napoleon wrasse. This is enormous. This is about 6 feet across. I'm talking about the green one now. About 6 feet across. We see them throughout the South Pacific. They have very distinctive patterns behind their eyes, and in fact, people who know an area and have been there enough times to see the same fish over and over again, they get to know them by the actual pattern of black stripes behind their eyes. They live, I've been told they live of order a century. It takes a while for them to get to this enormous size, as I said, about 6 feet in length. They swim quite large distances, and this is a characteristic fish. I'm not sure I can recall its name, but pelagic species, the species that swim great distances across the ocean, often have companions, and these are basically scavengers that just hang around. You see them around sharks, you see them around rays and other large fish. Basically, anything that might be a sloppy eater gets one of these guys hanging around, because you never know, it's an easier way to basically get the crumbs off the table of your friend than to catch dinner yourself. Very, very colorful. This is real color, the yellows and the reds and the greens and the blues. And it doesn't quite show up as well as I'd like. There's a just beautiful, very crisp pattern in here. This was an isolated one that I actually hung out with for a while in a dive. There are other places where I've actually seen them schooling, and you'll see 6 or 8 of these all together. But usually they tend to be 1 or 2 at a time.
How far away from them are you?
This one I could get pretty close to. Now my lens is a sort of modest, can do a modest telephoto kind of a thing, but I spent about 15 minutes with this fish, and I was like trying to get in position. You don't swim at it, of course. You sort of try to get over to its side, and then it would swim away. But it wasn't trying to avoid me. There are certain fish that you know as a photographer are just hopeless targets for your camera, because they just like are camera shy or human shy or something, and they go away. It didn't seem to mind that I was there. This is a male, by the way. The females are significantly smaller and don't have quite as many patterns. All right, going from the large to the very small. This is a shrimp. What I wanted to call your attention to is what is underneath it. What is underneath it is a sea cucumber. Sea cucumber itself was about that big, and this was just along for the ride. And it's not unusual seeing one animal, as I said, what is it on top of, and what is that on top of, and what is that on top of. There are other things that, in fact, a lot of divers, I think, miss when diving, because they are essentially transparent and you have to kind of go looking for them. Honestly, I got a little bored on one of the dives. It was a wall. It was a beautiful wall. I'm sure I could have spent hours there, but nevertheless, it was not that much different from the previous wall or the one before that. And much to the puzzlement of my dive companions, I sort of swam out from the wall a little bit, because I had noticed by shining my light around that there were occasional reflections coming back. And often those take the form of tiny jellyfish and other very, very interesting creatures that you would normally not notice. You have to shine light on them to see them. And finally, so I was swimming out maybe 30 feet from the wall while everybody else was at the wall, and I had my strobe set on my camera, just kind of like illuminating what was an inch or 2 above my camera. And then anytime I would see something with my flashlight, I would swim over to it and get it kind of in position and go click. So this is some type of jellyfish. You see these in the Monterey Bay Aquarium. I'm sure they have this colorful refraction pattern that travels up and down the spines. There's some colors up there, and there's some colors down there, and it's kind of like the running lights around a movie marquee or something like that. About maybe this big, something like that. But it's really quite amazing what you can find in the open water if you just know to go and look for it. And I've puzzled many of my dive companions over the years by swimming out and starting to take pictures of what appears to be absolutely nothing whatsoever. But then afterward, I get to show them what I was doing after all. You know, I'm not going to be able to identify this at all. I don't even have a guidebook that goes sort of, I don't want to be moralistic about what's high and what's low in the animal kingdom, but certainly a fairly primitive creature. And it's very hard to even find guidebooks, because most divers don't even look for this stuff. I'm sure any trained biologist in marine biology could tell you what this is. Obviously, there's a very interesting pattern of something in there. Don't know if that's digestion, or don't know anything about that. Sorry. And another mystery. This one was perhaps a couple of feet long. It was swimming. It was clearly wiggling this thing. Clearly has a head up there. Once again, you can't find this in a guidebook. Now, that doesn't mean it's an unfamiliar species. It just means I haven't seen it before, and I don't know how to find out what it is. Don't touch these things. Every one of these things will sting you if you get skin contact. So I decided to come up with a few themes to just proceed now. There are different kinds of it's not just the diversity of the animals, but it's what they do. That's what you really experience underwater. And so I thought we'd sort of break down the topic into a few different things. So for example, camouflage. So we're going to play a game now. Find the fish. I know a few people know where the fish is. Anybody? Okay, I'll get you started. It's not entirely a fish. It is a sponge and a fish. And let me just, and I think a lot of you probably see it. Let's go change the perspective a little bit. And here we are, close up. Here's the mouth, here's the eye, is a frogfish. They actually have remarkable similarity to sponges, and I understand they can change color as well. So that I'm sure you only see maybe 1% of the frogfish that you swim past as a diver because they blend in so well. I think that's an extraordinary example of adaptation to one's environment, that it can sit there. Now, I think it's retracted at the moment, but these are the ones that have the lures, and then when a fish swims by, chomp, it grabs it. They're quite entertaining to watch. Well, mostly they do nothing, but if you do ever see them swim, they just sort of are jet engines that hop along the bottom. It's very funny. Okay, find the fish. It is a fish, yeah. This is the eye, this is the eye, this is the mouth. It's the face of a flounder. Do people know how flounders live their lives? It's a life story that is very peculiar, where they start off as a vertically swimming animal with an eye on each side, and then as they mature, they turn sideways and the eyes literally migrate to the same side of the head. So the mouth would be nominally sideways, the way we would normally think of it, and then the coloration blends in perfectly with the sand. On the flip side, they actually do have different coloration, but you would never normally see that. What do they eat? I'm not sure of their diet. I suspect it's shrimps and small things like that. That seems to be what they're well suited for. They're not going to probably go out hunting big things. They're just going to come across things that are along the bottom. They certainly rarely go more than a foot or two above the bottom. Now this, I'll say find the fish, but once again, it kind of is a fish. This is one of the ugliest creatures I have ever seen in my life. It's a type of scorpion fish. If given a chance, it will bury itself in the sand and become almost completely invisible. In fact, I think this was what this one did. It's very weird in that it actually has spines that it uses almost like feet to claw its way along. It's basically the fins have evolved into something that almost makes it look like a spider, and just makes it look like this weird mutant hybrid something or other. But it has some very colorful patterns on these wings that are basically also the fins. Okay, another example of nice camouflaging pattern, hawkfish. Once again, I forgot to look this one up, but it's clearly doing its best to pretend to be a leaf and almost succeeding. This is a pygmy species of cuttlefish. So you can see its eyes, its tentacles, and it's got a sort of a tutu around the back. It's only about an inch or two long, and it's hiding on top of a red sponge. Find the fish, anybody? This is a shark. This is actually called a wobbegong. It blends in spectacularly, and they don't move. I guess occasionally they just sort of wait for food to come along and then grab it. There are only a few sharks that would be even remotely dangerous, and this surely isn't one of them. I've heard of people picking them up by their tails and just sort of dangling them. I don't recommend that. But they actually have a large school of small fish around them that are basically, once again, the scavengers that are waiting for something to come along that they can get a little piece of. It's called a flathead or a spadefish, also very, very well camouflaged. They have very interesting patterns on top of their eyes. I don't know what that's about, but the close-up of their eyes has a very interesting pattern on it. These are razorfish. They swim around vertically, and they look like a little field of grass. They're always in shallow water where there often is grass, except this grass moves around, so it does kind of stick out. And they often maintain a formation as they sort of wander around over the sand. It's very entertaining to watch. Anybody? There's a crab there. Okay, you can see the sort of its head. It's got its hind legs, and there's its big claws here and here. And if you weren't looking just a couple of inches across, if you didn't know it was there, you would swim right past it. Gives it an advantage, I assume, for whatever little shrimps and things it probably eats. Okay, find the fish. It's not too hard, really. This is another hawkfish and another one. But once again, they just basically sit down inside, in this case a sea fan, and just hang out. I won't say find the fish, but everybody see the octopus? Long-legged octopus, it's called, very spiky. Once again, does a beautiful job of camouflaging. But once it gets disturbed a little bit, it's off moving as fast as it can, and it gets a more streamlined position, but it becomes easier to see. And then one of the favorites, or not, depending on which diver you talk to, is the pygmy seahorse, just an extraordinary creature. Lives, as far as I know, only in the Indonesia region. I've seen it in several areas around Indonesia, the Solomon Islands, and some of those areas. Only discovered in the last 30, 40 years, in fact, about the size of a grain of sand. I'm sorry, a grain of rice, I'm sorry. But so you're talking about something maybe that big. And so this is a sea fan. Any particular species of pygmy seahorse is usually exactly the same pattern as the type of sea fan on which it lives. Apparently they live out their whole lives on sea fans, on the same sea fan, in fact. And always a challenge for photographers, but this one I managed to get in focus and he wasn't looking away. Here's another close-up of a different type of pygmy seahorse on another different type of sea fan. This is a pointer stick that was the dive master's way of pointing us so that we could actually see this darn little thing. That's, it's a dowel, metal dowel, probably 1/4 of an inch. So it gives you a sense of scale there. Of course, the best way to camouflage is to just have a cloak of invisibility. Here we have two anemone shrimp, and they are transparent. You can literally see through them. I always thought it was an amazing feat of engineering to be able to create an animal that is transparent, and yet it still has a brain and still has arms and legs and everything else. But challenging to photograph, because how do you photograph what's invisible? Here's another one, if you can see it there. Different species on a different type of coral, in fact, and bubble coral, and you can see the body and the pinchers and so on. All right, the other needs of the living creatures is shelter, another one. And here is a type of mantis shrimp living in a hole in the ground, but sticking its head out. I thought this one was a very nice little feat of engineering, that this guy had found a scallop shell, and was using that as the sort of major structural element of its little home. And these are fairly curious, so if you just hang out, when they see you, they will hide. But if you just hang out for a little while, they tend to stick their eyes out, and they are pretty intelligent and they have pretty good vision. So they know you're there, and they're actually sort of curious about what you're all about. And they know they can run and hide if they have to. Well, we humans often provide shelter for living things as well in the form of our trash, a bottle, and this is a small octopus, which as we were watching it, it tried to get away, and basically it looks like it had been there before and lived there, but it just sucked itself into the bottle, and but since it was glass, you could still see it in there. Another bottle with another in this case a fish taking advantage of it. Everybody loves anemone fish or clownfish, they're often called. They're generally, the correct term is anemone fish, actually. Trying to remember this species. This is not, I'm thinking tomato clownfish, but this is not, or tomato anemone fish. Particular type of anemone, the fish that each fish lives in only certain species of anemones. There are many different types of anemones, and each fish has a few species that it will live in. This is a more traditional look of a clownfish where it's got the 3 white bands. And so if you saw Nemo, then you know this should be familiar to you. And by the way, the underside of an anemone is not something you always see, but sometimes they curl up when they're eating, and so you see the outside rather than the tentacles. And you can see it's a very, very lovely purple color that is on the underside. There are other species that take advantage of the anemone, in this case a porcelain crab. Of course, anemones have a poison that keeps most creatures away. These particular species have all evolved to basically be immune to that poison, so it becomes a nice place for them to live. And then once again, they get the scraps off the table of the anemone fish when it eats. It's not at all clear that the anemone benefits in any significant way from this, although some anemone fish, if you approach them, they'll be very defensive about their anemone. So you can imagine that they're actually performing a service of protecting the anemone as well. Okay, these are shrimps inside a soft coral. You can see the polyps of the coral out here in the kind of a trunk structure. And here are the little eyes of of them all, and they all happen to be looking at me. This was on a night dive. I guess I caught their attention, but they were with my flashlight, and they were checking me out.
What about the two extras? The crab?
This is a small crab up there, yes. Right there is a crab. You find many different animals depending on how carefully you look inside these things. And I'll show you a few more, in fact. I just thought this was very cute, looking under a log in fairly shallow water on a night dive, and there I was face to face with this very, very large population of shrimps staring back at me, finding a nice refuge under there. One of the classic symbiotic relationships of all is the shrimp goby and its shrimp. So here you have two species that are utterly dependent upon one another. You have the goby that would be completely vulnerable to predators if it didn't have a hole to live in and has no ability to dig a hole. You have a shrimp that is blind, so it can dig a hole just fine, but it would never have any way of knowing whether it's safe to come out or not. So they make a deal, and the shrimp basically and the goby live together, and the shrimp does the housekeeping, and you watch them for a while, and you see the shrimp basically, once every minute, plowing out a huge ball of sand. I guess these are not very stable holes, and you have to keep cleaning them out. Meanwhile, the shrimp goby sort of sits there and watches. At a certain point, if you get too close, you can see it sort of jiggle its tail, and at that point, the shrimp will not come out anymore until somehow or other it knows it's safe again. And if you get even too much closer than that, then the shrimp goby swims away, or swims into the hole, I should say. So it's just great arrangement that the two of them have. And you see them in a lot of places in the South Pacific, always on sandy bottoms where they blend in. Another way to find shelter is to create it for yourself. This is referred to as a Christmas tree worm. They have a lovely spiral pattern. They come in a ridiculous array of different colors. And it's basically a tube worm. And so here is the before, and here is the after, where I just swam up a little bit too close to it. And you can see now that this worm has basically constructed a tube in the home. Remember, it's living on top of something else, in this case a coral. It sucks itself in, and it's gone. But if you wait around for a little while and you hold still, you can actually see them emerge again. And this one apparently wasn't too disturbed. And I've been to seen some where you couldn't get within 6 feet before they sucked themselves in, and others that you could swim right up to. I don't know if they were asleep or, no, they don't sleep, but who knows. Always a challenge for photographers is to get a good shot of a scallop. These are enormous. These are about this big. They have little light sensors. You can see them as little dots along the lips. Can you see that here and along the bottom as well? And so they're essentially motion detectors and light sensors. So any movement whatsoever and they close. And that is most often the way you find them, is that you notice them just as they are closing up because they saw you first. But if you can go up slowly enough and take a close look, these lips that are, of course, then what they're using to filter the water and food that's going in and out, quite spectacular patterns. Okay, for those that don't have shelter, they can basically defend themselves on their own. We have a porcupine fish. Sometimes you actually find them in shops, sort of inflated and shellacked or something. But anyway, when disturbed, they will puff up and I've actually seen people sort of play volleyball with them underwater, but I don't recommend that. And they also, like many other fishes, someone asked, there are patterns in the eyes, and I don't know what those are all about in terms of what role they play, but they're very common. You can see a kind of sparkly pattern over here too. So, say lionfish, which doesn't really have to worry very much about letting people know that it's there, so it's very colorful and very bright, and has very, very painfully poisonous dorsal spines. So if you were to brush against one, you would not be happy for a day or two. And so the reason these, and many of the scorpion fish and other animals that have those names, you see wasp fish, there's a reason why all these creatures have such names, and that is because they sting. They won't attack you, but if you step on them or brush against them, you will regret it. Back in Lembe Strait, this is just another variety of the, many. We saw probably a dozen different species of scorpion fish. And this one is obviously not afraid to announce its presence. It's basically making itself known. And here's another one. And they actually kind of use these wings for propulsion. So although they stay very close to the ground, but they use that for moving around. All right, and then this is a more traditional type of scorpion fish, one that you see throughout the South Pacific. There can be although this one is red and under light, it shows up quite well. If I were not shining light on it, it would not be red, and it would actually be quite difficult to see. So most people who encounter one of these and get stung, or do so not because they were being careless, not because they intended to, it's just because not because the fish were attacking them, which they don't do, but just because they didn't see it. The other way to protect yourself, of course, is to hide inside a shell. Hermit crabs are quite prevalent, and they can live in all kinds of different shells. I have on a few occasions, not on this trip, seen hermit crabs battle over a shell, and they sort of go at each other and try to pull one another out of the shell and so on. And another way to protect yourself is just to hang out with enough of your neighbors that, well, okay, let's deal with it. Some of us are going to get eaten, but hopefully it won't be me. These are cardinal fish on a shallow dive in the Lembe Strait. But of course, schooling behaviors are very common in the fish kingdom, and there's a good reason for that. All right. Of course, we wouldn't have any other of these creatures if it were not for reproduction. So here is just a happy family of two fish guarding their hole. If you approach them, the female will go down first and protect the home, and maybe there are eggs down there, I don't know. And if you approach a little closer, the male will dart away as well. This is one of those cases where I just see something and I don't have no idea what it is. Looks like it might be some kind of an egg in which some kind of a shellfish animal is forming, but I don't actually know. I see a sort of a conch shell kind of a thing in there. So that could be what it is, but who knows? Oh, very small. That big, maybe an inch or something. I'm sorry? Yeah. This could actually be the animal you're saying? Yeah, that could be, in fact, yes. That it's not so much an egg as a young, a juvenile that has its body partly inside the shell and partly outside the shell. Then here's just another example of, well, what the heck is that? It was, I don't know, very small, probably some kind of an eggshell, egg mass, but I have no idea. All right, one of the dives we did was called a Mandarin fish dive. You go down into 10 feet of water at a particular time, just around sunset, to a particular coral head, and it's always one coral head that they know about, and you wait. And the coral head is intrinsically extremely boring. You can kind of see it there. But as you wait around, it gets to a particular time of the evening and little movements start to show up. And maybe some of you can see just a little colorful pattern in there. And if you wait around a little longer, and it's only at this particular time in the evening, then okay, there we're starting to see another better view of it. And finally, oh, there its head comes out. These are just ridiculously colorful fish, about 2 inches, 3 inches in size. I've been on several Mandarin fish dives that ended with this. And that's pretty good. I got a picture, you know. Saw something, saw some eyes, and then they check each other out. You might see a couple of Mandarin fish, and then they disappear, and that's it. We were a little luckier on this particular occasion because what they're doing is at least thinking about mating. And this happens every night. Well, they don't mate every night, but occasionally they do. And on this particular evening, while we were watching, a larger one, here's the male, started putting on a display for this smaller one, which is the female, and they actually proceeded to go through their whole mating ritual in front of our eyes. And here is the sort of dance they do that after chasing each other around a little bit, they basically swim up into the water together, and this is the Mandarin fish in the process of mating. The female, as I said, is the smaller one. And they did this, these particular pair did it 3 times while we're watching. Every about 5 minutes or so, it would do this again. So here's a view kind of looking down on them. So, as I said, I've been on other Mandarin fish dives. They're beautiful fish if you can see them, but often they just stick their heads out and then say, maybe tomorrow I have a headache. But this time they didn't.
Did they ferret live young?
No. They would then go back down into the coral head and lay their eggs there. Yeah. Now, one of the puzzles I have, we have seen Mandarin fish several different places in the South Pacific, thousands of miles apart. But any particular Mandarin fish only ever lives in one coral head. So how do you get Mandarin fish in the Solomon Islands and in Indonesia and various places in Indonesia? I just find that very puzzling. I don't know, maybe storms just occasionally sweep one to a very distant location where it finds a right coral head and you know, it doesn't have to happen many times before you have a species spreading like that. But it is pretty amazing that it's only in certain coral heads that people know about. I mean, there's probably many we don't know about. But the dive boats go there occasionally, and if it's the right time of night, this is what you might see. I noted earlier, juveniles often look very, very different from their adult versions. This, I believe, is a sweetlips, but the large fish is striped and this big, and the small one is frilly and brown and spotted, and maybe that big. And this, I thought, is just adorable, a puffer. It does have a tail. It's not just a spherical fish, which is almost what it looked like. But here there is a tail that is very curled up, and here's one of the fins on the side as well. But it looked like basically the closest I've ever come to a spherical fish. Here we have one fish that I've looked for years. I've seen a few. This is called a batfish, or often a spadefish. Let me show you the adult. That's what the adult looks like. They have I think they're quite beautiful. They have a sort of almost human-looking head, and this one actually basically followed us around for an entire dive. It was very strange. It was obviously very curious about us. It was not in a school. It was swimming on its own, and just every time I turned around on an entire hour-long dive, there was this spadefish like hovering above me, which was very strange. But they look very different as juveniles. They're black. You can see the white pattern, the patterns that will eventually engulf it and make it a much brighter sort of gray-white fish. And there are species that have a couple of stripes there. But then it has this orange trim, and it looks literally like a bat on its side even. This one was just swimming around. It was about this big. It was quite a large fish, swimming back and forth under some corals.
Can you back up to the other one again?
That's there. So they are the same fish, the same species. Yes.
They're big.
Yeah, they're not small. These are the large ones. The adult's probably this big. And it's almost like the small one. The juvenile probably wasn't much smaller. It's just like sort of it starts that way and then the body eventually fills in or something. Feeding behavior. Obviously, everything down there has to eat something. This is a crinoid, sometimes called a basket star. What I just wanted to call your attention to is it's got feet. And it clings on to a coral here, and it opens up, typically at night, but this was daytime, and just filters whatever comes by. But there are better places to filter feed than others. And so they walk. And unfortunately, I have some older videos that I wasn't able to pull up that actually show a crinoid walking. But the thing is, for a creature to walk, you would think it needs a brain. I would. And I don't know where you put a brain in that thing, because it pretty much just doesn't look like that sort of thing. But to have enough of a neural system inside this creature that it actually can go to more favorable locations. It looks like a plant, but it's not. Of course, it's not a plant, but it looks like it's something that would sit still forever. And it, in fact, doesn't do that. Now, at night, a lot of creatures come out to feed. This was a very tiny, maybe size of my thumbnail, crab sitting on top of a soft coral on a night dive. And this is, this has some very interesting things going on in here. First of all, I was basically focusing on this shrimp, another mostly transparent shrimp living on a sea fan. But that's not all that's there. Do you see these look like sort of, I don't know, they've been described as looking a little bit like rabbits or you know, with weird long ears, or mosquitoes or something like that. You can find them on some sea fans at night. They are incredibly tiny. They are, they're not really in focus here, but you can at least see them and appreciate them. I don't know where they go during the day, but during the night they come out and they're basically just hanging out waiting for something to filter, some kind of food to filter as it goes by. But they move. They're clearly animals. They're clearly mobile. Just quite extraordinary to watch, though. This is a crab hanging out at night to see what might come by, or maybe even eating those little mosquito-like creatures that who knows. Crabs, of course, don't filter feed. They actually hunt. Okay, here's some more of these little, mosquito is the best term I can use on another view. You can, essentially every one of these things, although they're not really in focus very well, is out there eating. Feeding behavior, another form of it. These are catfish. These are juvenile catfish, maybe that big. I believe they are, litter is the wrong term, but I believe they are essentially all fish that have been born at the same time from the same mother, from the same clutch of eggs. And they stay together for a very long time, and they are very, very densely packed, and they sort of work their way along the bottom. Well, on one night dive that we did, we were rather startled to see an adult group of catfish doing the exact same thing. This was like almost the kind of thing you see in a horror movie. I mean, it was like this storm approaching us, and literally hovering just a few feet above the bottom. We had to wait afterward for the dust to settle because it was like a sandstorm. Have you ever seen those big wall sandstorm pictures from Iraq or something? Well, that's what it looked like, except it was made of fish, and they were all sort of churning up the bottom. Seahorse out not paying too much attention to me because it was clearly looking for small food and just working its way along the bottom. And this is called a pipefish, related to the seahorse and very similar, but it doesn't really have a body bulge. It's just looks almost like a pipe or a snake even kind of a thing. But it's got a narrow snout, very characteristic of the seahorse. And once again, not paying any attention to me, just out grazing. Everybody loves turtles. This one was interrupted while eating. They don't usually care very much. And because they're very sloppy eaters, you often see them with other, in this case out of focus, fish around them because they're just going down, digging up what they can. They have very strong beaks. They can pull up all sorts of food. And once they do, there's a lot of leftovers that anybody who's around can chow down. All right, this is I forgot, I had the name of the eel, but it's living in a hole in the ground. It just sticks its head up at night. During the day, it's invisible completely, and sticks its head up at night and waits for something to come by. And we watched this one for a little while. It didn't do too much, though. Now, the next one, okay, this is one of those things you see every now and then, and you say, where does that fit into the family tree of life on Earth? All right, the name, well, I don't know the official scientific name. They haven't been known for very long, maybe 30, 40 years. And the popular name is the bobbit worm. Does this ring a bell with anybody? And it's actually not for the reason that you think. So, I don't know, we've all had lunch, maybe I shouldn't go into the details, but they reproduce, the female makes sure after she's finished mating that the male will never reproduce again, let me just put it that way. And if you want more information, look it up on Wikipedia. But let me just say, it's a type of worm, so I mean, you can actually kind of see some similarities to some other creatures. It's got beautiful iridescence. Only seen very rarely. The dive master, who had obviously been on hundreds of dives at this location, had never seen one before. And we were out, he saw it after I did. I watched it for a while and went away, and others came along. On a night dive, and it just basically, I saw it stick its head out of the water, out of the hole and then go back down. What it's basically doing is when it's fully retracted into the hole, all you see is this, and it really disappears. You can't see much of anything. But as you wait, it comes up because it's basically looking for anything it can to swim by. It's aggressively eating. It's not a filter feeder. It's basically grabbing shrimp and krill or whatever it is that happens to be swimming by. And they can eat rather large things. It does have a mouth back there, yeah, in between some of those tentacles. All right. Wrapping up with one of my favorite dives, this was a particular arrangement of currents that brought in this huge, huge population of bait fish, actually anchovies. And that meant dinner time for the local population of Mobius rays. These are manta rays, but they're very small, sort of maybe this size, small for a manta ray. And they were hunting, and you can just appreciate how the fish, how a schooling behavior, even though each individual fish is doing its own thing, they respond collectively to these manta rays. And a single ray would have a great deal of trouble feeding off of that, but it wasn't just one ray. It was actually a group of them, and they would basically corral the fish, and then one would just sort of plunge in and get his or her fill, and then move on. And they would take their turns. And it was just a whole performance for us to watch. Fascinating. Cleaning behavior seems like it might not be important, but fish need dental hygiene too, I suppose. And they get it in the form of cleaner wresses. And in this case, this is a unicorn fish. They basically have stations that somehow exist in which the cleaner fish and the cleaner shrimp hang out, and then the larger fish know that, and they can come in, and they just hover out there. And this guy is actually opening up its dorsal fin, which is normally not open this way, and then the fish swim around it, and sometimes you can even see them swimming into the mouths. Certainly smaller shrimps and all can swim into the mouths. And if you take off your glove and stick your dirty fingernails in front of some of these shrimp, they will actually clean out your fingernails. Then just one of my favorite subjects for any dive is manta rays. This was another cleaning station that was well established, and the rays would come in, and we got a particularly good performance one day, watching perhaps a dozen different rays taking turns at the cleaning station. It's got a big mouth, but it's not eating. They eat krill. The fish that are around them, and probably mostly fish that you can't see, are basically going inside the mouth and in through the gills and cleaning out the debris that's in there. So unfortunately, you can't capture this in still photography, so I did a little bit of experimentation where I just took a lot of pictures, and these are just individual stills, but you can now see, if you want to know what the inside of a manta ray looks like, here you're actually seeing the gills of the manta. And so, and actually, if it were light above, you actually would see through. I mean, that's just open. But let me pull up some where I actually had sequences. These were just sometimes they didn't care about us much, and they were swimming quite close. And this one was a nearly black one, which you don't often see. And this is another one of those freeloaders that just hangs out near anything big and gathers whatever debris it might be able to gather. So here are some sequences I took just to show you the way they're just beautiful flying through the water. That's the best I could do with a still camera. Here was this unusual black one that also you could see swimming by. The nice thing about being down there with the fish is that sometimes you're not just the observer, you become the participant. And this was a just marvelous time I spent with a small group of gobies. These are not aggressive fish. They don't know how to do anything but hide in a hole in the ground, so I don't see how curiosity would be a beneficial trait for them to have. But nevertheless, we hung out for a while, and I was on one side of the coral head and they were on the other, and they would look up and check me out, and then they'd hide because, oh, I'm still there. And then I would swim up a little bit and take a picture, and then they'd, just hang out there. But they weren't swimming away, they weren't afraid. And it's just one of those times when you actually get a chance to have some real interaction with another piece of the animal kingdom, something that doesn't happen all that often. And I was actually quite close to these guys. By the way, there's one a little more timid hiding down in there. And when you dive, you learn something about the facial expressions of cuttlefish. This one is saying, "Go away, I don't like you at all." The tentacles going up like that is very distinctive. Cuttlefish are another very intelligent animal that basically communicates with you. You know that when you're looking at it, it's looking back at you. And this one was not happy. Sometimes they don't mind too much, but this one was not happy. So here's if this were real scientific talk, which, well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't, I would be ending with my conclusions, and I sort of kind of have some. This is just, I couldn't find this idea on the web, although it must be out there. I surely didn't invent it. But why do you get so much biodiversity in certain places? I've been to the rainforest in Peru. I've been to many dive sites like this around the world. What is it that just produces so much diversity of life in such a small area? And my name for it, which I can't identify on the web, is called runaway evolution. And the idea is that, okay, suppose we have a little house, which I'm going to represent as a little ecological niche. Something can live inside that house. Then the way evolution works, just without any guidance, something or other evolves along that can live inside that house. And that's fine, so that's how evolution works. Ecological niche, species, one or more, come in that produce it, that can live inside it. Well, the key point, and this is a mathematical concept that almost anybody's familiar with, is what if each new species that comes along creates niches of its own? Remember, every animal is living on another animal, is living on another animal, and it's animals all the way down. So each species creates more niches than it occupies. So that means more opportunities. So now you have a couple of additional houses that were created by the introduction of this new species. And then the process continues. So now you get some more animals that can live in those, and you get some more houses, and the whole process continues. And I think, at least in my very primitive way of understanding it, that is how the world evolved from 225 million years ago, Pangea, and one very, very large ocean, to the diversity that we experience today. So thank you.
Okay, we could turn the lights up, and Mark, thank you very much. Amazing diversity of life here on Earth. Speaks to what life might be like out there. Let me, I think we have time for a couple of questions, and then we are going to have a birthday cake here in just a moment. So questions, anyone? Neil.
How deep do you dive? And also, you mentioned that there are some dangerous animals. Have you ever been injured, or has anyone been injured on one of your dive trips?
How deep do we dive? The deepest dive I ever did was to a wreck of a World War II destroyer that was about 170 feet. Rarely do you dive below 100. Usually I don't dive below 80 or 100 feet. There's got to be a good reason to go much below about 80 or 100 feet. Injuries, no. I'll tell you about some interesting stories, but in fact, of the 600 dives I've done, of the people who have been on those dives, that's probably now about 6,000 person dives. I know of no injury ever. So it is a much safer sport than people give it credit for.
Thank you. Over Christmas and New Year, I was in Bali and then took a very ramshackle boat where we swam and my son-in-law dived on various islands that didn't have names until we got to Komodo Island, where one of the dragons had just eaten a 6-year-old boy. So we carried our 7-year-old boy.
Wow.
But my son-in-law in
I've been
diving,
to Komodo, in fact, but yeah, that's a terrifying.
in diving, my son-in-law was actually attacked, and his scalp was bitten. You could see holes in it by a fish. He felt the bump hard, and swam. He felt it first of all at the back of him, and then something hit his head, and the dive master sort of told him to get out of there. And when he came up, it was all bleeding, and for several days it was very sore.
I'm guessing it was a Titan triggerfish. There is the perhaps scariest fish is not a shark. It is a particular kind of fish. I didn't have a picture, unfortunately, but they build a nest, and they believe that the entire sort of conical space above their nest belongs to them. So if you wander into that space, you can be attacked, but only while they're nesting. I've been around hundreds of Titan triggerfish and never had a problem. I believe I have friends here in the room who have other stories to tell. They're quite large and they have big teeth. They eat coral, or they chip apart coral. So I suspect it was one of those cases. I have heard of attacks by Titan triggerfish.
What mixture of gases are you breathing, and how long do you allow to come up?
It's for extended diving, I tend to do nitrox, which is it's basically nitrogen and oxygen, just like what we breathe, but it's a higher mixture of oxygen, about 32% instead of what we breathe here is about 21%. That's better because it's the nitrogen buildup in your blood that can potentially cause the bends. But on nitrox and with a dive computer nowadays, if you pay attention to what your dive computer is telling you to do, very few people get the bends. It's just very, very safe. And it's only for really special occasions and people with much more training than I have, that you go to some of these more exotic gas mixtures. We just use oxygen and nitrogen and a little different mixture.
Hi, Mark. You mentioned towards the end that you had a few encounters where you felt there was really an interaction between you and whatever was out there. I was wondering if you might share another story about one of your favorites.
You must have been planted in the audience. I couldn't dig up the video, and I sort of wanted my next talk. I'll show some video because I know I have it. When you're diving and someone else asks us about the gas mixture, you do a safety stop at 15 feet. You spend maybe 3 to 5 minutes. It's an opportunity for that last bit of nitrogen that's built up in your blood system, in your bones and muscles and blood, to escape before you go that last 15 feet to the surface. On Mary Island in the Solomons, I was at 15 feet, and there was a school of jacks, silvery fish, about yay big, 100,000 of them, I don't know. You couldn't even begin to count them. That was also at 15 feet. And I was surfacing by myself. Some of my friends were still down below. I said, hey, I'm at 15 feet, you're at 15 feet, you want to hang out together? And I swam slowly into this school of fish, and they welcomed me. And I ended up spending my safety stop and a bit more, until I really had to surface, swimming with a school of silverfish. I could see nothing but fish. Everywhere I looked, I saw fish. Literally, it was an opaque cloud of fish. And we swam around together, and I have no idea where I went. I kept an eye on my depth. A friend of mine, actually here in the room, says he looked up from his dive, was still continuing, saw this big school of fish with bubbles coming out of it. And it was actually the one I was in. There's this primal thing about joining that environment where you just, you can shut off your brain. I don't have to think anymore. There's something very primal about the experience of swimming with a school of fish where the intelligence of the masses is clearly adequate for its purposes, and you just don't really have to do anything but follow the tail of the fish in front of you. So that was one of my favorite experiences of all time.
Okay, I think I'm going to reserve the last question for me, and then we're going to have a surprise get rolled into the room, and we're going to sing happy birthday to Inger. But Mark, my question to you is, so do you believe life exists beyond planet Earth?
And I'm speaking to my boss's boss's boss right now. Is that absolutely, positively? You know, I guess the lesson I take out of this, and if I guess we're at the SETI Institute, we should make that connection. When life can form, or, you know, basically ecological niches and the evolution process is such a robust process and one that operates so quickly. When you consider 225 million years from Pangea and a primitive Pacific Ocean and what we think of as primitive life forms, to not just that biodiversity, but the Amazon biodiversity and the Mountain View biodiversity for that matter, it just seems inevitable to me that this is a process that's got to happen elsewhere. If life can get started, and I don't know how that happens, that's not my department, but once life starts, it's going to evolve.
Well, Mark, thank you very much. Everyone join me in thanking Mark Showalter.